Just a quick word of warning before we get going that the following podcast will almost certainly contain spoilers and may also contain strong language and conversations of an adult nature.
Hello and welcome to episode 16 of Strong Language and Violent Scenes, the podcast giving a second chance to films that might not deserve them. I'm Mitch Bain, I'm a horror writer and an occasional doer of musical things.
And I'm Andy Stewart. I make disgusting films and write about films and a whole bunch of stuff related to films.
And joining us tonight, you know him best as the director of the Shudder exclusive film Beyond the Gates. Joining us tonight, Mr. Jackson Stewart. Jackson, hello.
Hi, how's it going?
Very good,
Very
man.
well, thank you. Thank you for doing this.
You're very welcome. I actually had no idea Beyond the Gates was Shudder exclusive over there, so that's you just informed me of something I had utterly no clue about. So thank you.
That's how it's billed over here. Yeah.
Really?
Although you can,
okay.
you can buy it. You can buy it on DVD because I revisited it again today.
Yeah, I own it as well. Yeah.
So yeah.
Oh, right on.
But the film that we're here to talk about first and foremost, you've picked an interesting one, Jackson. I had not heard of this before. I hadn't seen it, but I hadn't heard of it. So you've gone for 1987's White of the Eye.
Yes.
Yeah.
I sure did.
Generally, first off, I normally do kind of get a little bit of background for why you chose it.
Yeah, so this was a really interesting movie because I heard about it a few years ago, and they were playing it at the Silent Movie Theater here in town. And they were doing this thing called the United States of Horror, and they were picking different horror movies for each sort of state. And, for Arizona, which is where I grew up, they picked White of the Eye, and I was like, what the fuck is White of the Eye? I was like, I've never heard of this. And it was made in 1987, which is still kind of in my sweet spot for horror movies. And I missed the screening, but I ended up catching it later on, I think through Shout Factory had put it out on Blu-ray, and I just blind bought it. But I watched it, and I was like, it takes place in Tucson, which is my hometown, and I'd truly never seen anything like it. And I just was like, I was completely obsessed with it for like months and months after watching it. Like I watched it, I think, 5 times or something within the first month that I watched it, and I just kept reading about it, and I was just like, I've literally never seen a movie like this before. And it made a very big impact on me, and I found a lot of people that I've shown it to just absolutely hate it. And like, I don't think it did terribly well with critics or even, box office wise when it was released. There's like a trailer for it that's floating around that's very kind of deceptive for like what the movie is. It just makes it look like sort of a generic thriller.
Okay.
Yeah, so I mean that it's a movie I've been very fascinated by, and that was why I wanted to discuss it further with you guys.
And you did pick it pretty much instantly when we were talking about this. So sorry, just for clarity. So how long ago was it that you came across it for the first time?
I watched it in, I think it was 2015.
Okay.
It was like toward the end of 2015, so it was very recent. This will sound incredibly pretentious, but it is really rare that there's one of these movies made in that era that I haven't seen or heard of read something about. Donald Cammell co-directed performance with Nicholas Roeg, and he's a phenomenal director in his own right. But yeah, that was also a very big draw for me.
Watching you watch it, Mitch, was quite fun. You had a look of just sheer confusion almost the entire time.
I wouldn't say the entire time. I would say and we can get into it. But yeah, there was a lot of things about it that I found on first watch. And like I said, this is super fresh. I watched this today. Wow. And yeah, there was a lot of things about it that I found to be kind of disorientating, but we can get into that.
Yeah, sure.
Before we do, though, Jackson, we make everyone that comes on the show do this one thing. every now and again, people out there will listen to these without having seen the films. Generally, obviously, we kind of recommend if you can hunt them down. And White Eye, it's accessible in the UK.
Arrow Video have got a double disc Blu-ray package out of White of the Eye, so you can find that.
But yeah, for the benefit of anyone who is listening without having seen the film, we kind of task the guest with, we put 30 seconds on the clock and ask them to do their best to sum up the plot of the film. So with a count in, are you ready to do that?
Oh man,
this should be an interesting one.
I'll give it my best shot. Yeah.
Okay, right, here we go. 3, 2, 1, go.
So, White of the Eye centers around a husband and a father who has a successful stereo installing business and some darker impulses that he's kind of repressed as he's gotten into his married life and fatherhood. And those end up coming out in some pretty disturbing, gruesome ways over the course of the film. There.
30 seconds disappears fast, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But yeah, I would say like it's an overview, and not bad. We've had some disastrous efforts with that before, like some absolute howlers. But yeah, I think we should just jump right in because there's quite a lot to unpack, especially early on, I think.
Yeah. I would say, the first thing though I do want to say is it starts with that good old Canon Films logo, which I really miss.
Yep.
You love a good Canon Films logo.
Yeah, I love an old Canon Films logo. It gets me all excited.
Yeah, it's always a strong start for a movie.
But then it's it's kind of hard to talk about this one. It starts with a kind of mishmash of stock footage of eagles flying around. It launches into an almost Argento-like murder scene.
Oh yeah. That's very much like a giallo in that opening, and then there's like the fish flopping around, which I think is really disturbing, and it's
so weird. That's such a weird decision.
It's like swimming around in the meat juice too, which I think is also really disgusting. And it's just all that slow-mo and like the glass shattering. And he picks some really unusual camera angles to film that like POV stuff through, because a lot of it, the woman is not in focus, which I think there's a deeper reason for that within the movie. But it's like you see him kind of closing in on her, and it's like her head is obscured. You don't really get a good sense of her, and he's just kind of rushing through the house, kind of going in all directions in this sort of nervous, frenetic energy. And it's a really eerie scene. Like I remember watching that, and I'm like, okay, I've not seen a murder photographed in this way before, and it creates a really unsettling effect for the opening of the movie, and it's totally explosive. And
I kind of thought the same when I was watching it earlier. I thought, I have never seen a murder scene like this before.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons that we're all here is because we've all seen a lot of murder scenes. And I remember thinking that it was like, you're right. I mean, the way it's put together with the kind of the close-ups of the eyes and all the kind of POV stuff is really frenetic. But also, just when you get to the actual murder, everything about it is designed to be disorientating and totally chaotic, and it worked for me in that way. Because I remember just thinking, it was like I kind of couldn't look away from it because everything about the way it was presented was so jarring.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of like what else was, in like the sort of like thriller horror space was being made around this time, but it doesn't really feel like there's a solid equivalent of it. To me, it's, even to this day, it's like I have a really hard time finding like a companion piece for this movie as far as like doing like a double feature. I mean, like the only one I think would be close is maybe like, the Scorsese Cape Fear. I think there's there's a few kind of commonalities between them, at least in like how they're shot, and just that really, dynamic, kind of in your face camera movement that they're pulling off. But it's like the way it opens is super jarring. They have like all the transitions of Tucson and that like weird bleach bypass effect that they do over the footage that makes it look incredibly grainy. Yeah. And the film is composed by two of the members of Pink Floyd. It's Nick Mason and I can't remember the other guy's name. But it's like the score is super weird. You know, it's like it's just not like the standard that you'd expect for this kind of like southwestern thriller. You know, it's like the opening music is just super bright and like it's like almost something you'd hear in like a country music bar, which is very weird to me. But yeah, you know, and then you guys can kind of go into it.
I love the score. I think the score.
Absolutely.
I think the score's brilliant.
The score is another thing that I think is deliberately designed to feel jarring and strange, and it works in that way pretty much front to back, I think.
Absolutely.
We come out of that, and it's weird because obviously, like, that is kind of so chaotic, and that we kind of come straight out of that and cut to kind of this relative, I don't want to say domestic bliss, but it's you get your protagonist, you've got Paul, and just the family.
Yeah, the Whites. Paul, yeah.
If you like,
yeah. Sorry, Paul and Joan White and their daughter Danielle, who's a weird fucking kid.
So weird.
Yeah.
I mean, it's also too. It's like you look at David Keith and Cathy Moriarty. Cathy Moriarty, I think, is just stunningly beautiful. But like you look at the two of them, and you're like, how did that kid come out of this? Like I hate like picking on, you know, child actors or whatever, but like,
we're going.
She just does not look anything like either of them, you know. And it's I'm kind of curious if she was maybe like a local hire or how they found her. There's a lot of really interesting stories about Donald Cammell when he was making this movie. You know, there's a few extras on at least on the Shout or Scream Factory Blu-ray over here, where one of the actors who plays his best friend that he, you know, David Keith had stolen Cathy Moriarty from.
Oh yeah.
He was saying like he didn't really give any kind of direction, and he would start explaining stuff in the movie, and he'd have absolutely no idea what he was talking about. Like there was, this is getting a little bit ahead, but there was a scene where he said they spent like weeks and weeks developing these contact lenses that were supposed to cost like $5,000 or $10,000. That was going to have like a cloud in the pupil of the eye,
right?
And so he said it was supposed to be like the culmination of the entire movie was they would do this like macro lens shot on his eye, and there would be a cloud in it. And he was explaining it to the actor. And he was like, okay, but like, what is the significance of that? Like, why does his eye turn into this cloud? And he absolutely couldn't explain it to him. Like, he had no idea what it meant. And so, you know, I think there's something really fascinating when, you know, some of these guys who are a little unbalanced make these kinds of movies, because I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but Donald Cammell committed suicide I think in 98 or 99.
Oh, wow, okay.
And there's another messed up thing, but his mode of death or his mode of suicide is actually in this movie, which is another very, very chilling thing about it.
What?
Oh, I think you need to expand on
yeah, I was
that,
gonna say, what are we
Jackson.
talking
I think
about
you've
here?
got to expand on that.
So when David Keith is holding that woman's head underwater in the bathtub, he holds the mirror up to her,
right?
So she can like look at herself die. This is even weirder if you can believe that. But with his wife, there was
China Kong.
Yeah. She's the co-writer of this movie.
Yeah, she's in it. She works. She works in the kind of cafeteria. There's like a cafe or a kind of diner.
Yeah,
she's working there.
Yeah. So he convinced his wife that he was like, okay, I don't want to live anymore, and so he got her to shoot him through the top of his skull with like a 38 or something, and he had her hold up a mirror to him so he could watch himself die.
Oh my god!
Fucking hell.
Yeah, and I remember finding that out, I think, after I'd watched the movie. My friend Phil Blankenship told me about that. And then when I rewatched it, I was like, what the fuck? I was like, okay, this very much comes from an unsound mind, which I think is why the movie has that sort of effect that it does. Yeah, I went off on a big tangent there. I just
that's valuable material.
That's worth including.
That has changed the tone of this conversation quite dramatically.
Well, the thing is, I mean, like that sequence. I mean, obviously, like you say, we're jumping ahead a fair bit, but like that sequence was. I had it marked down in the notes that I took when I was watching it. That was the kind of scariest moment in the film for me, and the most disturbing moment.
Yeah, very much so.
And that is now true, like tenfold.
Yeah, totally. Well, and it's also too. It's like if you look at how long it took from the making of this movie to him doing that, and then thinking about how much longer that was probably in the guy's head.
Yeah.
You know, it's like that guy had been fantasizing about that for over a decade.
Wow.
You know, and it's
shit.
like it's a really disturbing window into someone's mind, and it's very rare you kind of get that. You get that out of a filmmaker, you know, where you get to like know some intimate detail about them and through one of their movies. And yeah, you know, it's like that's a big part of why I think it has that eerie, surreal effect that it does.
That is insane. And here was me. I was just about to lighten things up as well by talking about the fact that
I was gonna say...
by talking about the fact that Danielle, when we first meet Danielle, she's been sent home from school because she seems to have this habit of going around socking people in the back.
Yeah.
I thought that was really funny because when she says it's like I socked him in the back, and it's not just that she's like going around hitting people, because Joan, her response to her is like, "What have I told you about socking people in the back?"
Yeah, that's her thing.
It's like such a weirdly specific admonishment.
Yeah, well, it's also I like that they set up this idea that, you know, the sort of like violence from, you know, the dad is like rolling down onto her, how it's sort of like a cyclical thing that's like passed on through generations. You know, it's like a nice foreshadowing for that, because most of the movie, I mean, this is obviously like hugely spoilery, so it's like you don't know he's killing all these people from the beginning. You know, it is a mystery, and you do uncover it over the course of the movie. You do sense there's something very wrong with him, but it's like they don't. You know, it's not made explicit until, you know, a little ways through the runtime.
Yeah, no, totally.
But also, not just the fact that the dad's got that the dad's kind of passing stuff on, perhaps on his daughter, but so's the mum. And there's a point where she's trying to kind of direct Danielle down a different road by talking about what it is to be antisocial. And then we see her in flashback pretty much doing exactly the same thing and being pretty antisocial when she distraughtly, she puts the cigarette out in the 8-track machine and pours her drink into the guy's 8-track. It's kind of, the whole thing's kind of cyclical, it seems.
Absolutely. It's I don't want to keep like commandeering this thing. But
fine.
Did you?
That's fine.
Whatever feels
You
right,
can
man.
steamroll over this whole thing as much as you like, so like, don't worry about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's like I think it's interesting too how, you know, on paper this guy sort of has like this sort of like picturesque American dream life where he's got, you know, the beautiful wife, he has a kid, he's got a good career.
Yeah,
you know,
obviously doing something that he identifiably loves as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, totally. And it's like, you know, you see he's really good at his job, like when he goes in there and he's like getting into all the minutia and specifics of like what kind of system the guy wants and everything. And it's like it's still not enough to kind of sate this like destructive nature that he has within him. You know, and it's like you see it, you know, through a lot of the flashback scenes with his friends where like they go and, you know, they have that hunting scene where he goes and like kills that deer and then he's like smearing the blood all over his face. And then he goes and like kisses his friend and you're just like, what the fuck is wrong with this dude? Like it's really fascinating to see that these kind of like external happinesses or signs of success are not enough to really like fix what's wrong with him internally. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I think that's some really like mature, impressive filmmaking that typically like, or not always. I mean, a lot of other movies do show, you know, it's like Cape Fear is actually a really good counter to that, where you see, okay, the guy has the great career and the wife and the kid and the huge house, and it's still like they have a ton of problems. They're, not working through them, and they keep kind of like, causing their own sort of chaos within these situations. But it's I always like when movies can kind of delve into that stuff where it's not just like, oh, you get the money, you get the, the significant other, and then, the kid, and then your life is perfect all of a sudden, because it really never is. It's like whatever, benchmark you hit along the way, it's like, I'm sure all of us have had these things where you're like, oh, if I just get this, then I'll be happy and all my problems will go away. And then you get those things and they don't fix your problems. It's like your problems evolve into something new, because suddenly you're like, oh, I need to maintain this, or I need to keep this in order, or there's like, or this thing could leave me. And there's just a lot of rich thematic material to mine from that.
Mm-hmm.
And I really think it's impressive that Donald Cammell kind of went that deep on a movie like this. That's like a really fascinating draw for me as well.
Does Paul have some kind of powers? He keeps doing this kind of sound thing where he like hums really loudly.
Yeah, I think it's like to let it echo through. Yeah, because obviously, like, just for clarity and for color, we get the job that he's doing is he's kind of like, he installs high-end sound equipment.
Yeah, he builds a kind of bespoke sound systems.
And he's but he's also like a complete audiophile. And yeah, when he goes into places, he kind of makes this noise that kind of echoes around, and then he just.
Well, I believe it's to like test the acoustics in there, to kind of like figure out where the best place to install it is. Another guy you guys should, speaking of audiophiles, is Graham Resnick. You guys should totally have him on this. He's like the craziest audiophile I've ever met. He knows more about sound than like anyone I've ever met. But getting into that world is almost like learning like brain surgery, just because there's so many crazy depths and just like intricacies in that world, and like all the high end equipment. There's just so much stuff that goes into it that I think for me, where I don't have like a huge interest in a lot of that stuff. It's like it's really fascinating to hear these guys just go off on all the technical aspects of it. Like the other thing too is, I always really like in movies when someone's an expert at something, even if they're like an expert at churning butter or like air vulcanization or something. You're just like, oh, that's really cool. Like they dedicated their life to this thing, and then they became really good at it, and they're an expert in their field. It's always fascinating to me, whatever it might be.
That's a good shout, actually, because the scene where we're properly really introduced to Paul, or I think the scene where you learn the most about him early on, is when the first time you see him kind of making that noise and talking immediately about where he would put everything and stuff like that. I thought that was a really endearing introduction to a character for precisely that reason.
Absolutely. I mean, it's like he does come off as likable in this movie. I mean, even after like a lot of the like really reprehensible stuff he does, he's still sort of charming in a lot of the scenes. Like Adam Wingard is like also a huge fan of this movie.
Oh,
but
really?
it's easy to see. There's definitely some bits from this that I think they took inspiration from The Guest.
The Guest,
because there's stuff with Dan Stevens in that, when he's chasing, the brother and sister through that maze at the end of the movie, at the end of The Guest, and it's like he's still sort of likable, even though he just like murdered, their parents, and he's like he's complete psychopath. Like he's still charming. And the same thing too with David Keith, like when he's like during the big explosive climax, there's a bunch of stuff he says where it's like it's sort of funny and like just charming, and he just has this like kind of light view of everything going on around them, and it's like it's weirdly endearing. Like you're not supposed to like this guy, but you still kind of do in some ways.
Yeah. I love when we're introduced to David Keith in Flashback, when he comes out and he's got that insane mullet and that big enormous necklace that he's wearing.
Yeah, it's like, I can't remember, is it like shark teeth that he has, or it's not? It's like
a really thick leather thong with like some kind of like, shells or like stones.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, it's like this really like pointed kind of like teeth looking things that are around his neck. It's such an insane design. Like
the whole look is an insane design.
Yeah. I felt like that was like deliberately designed to timestamp the flashback.
I think so. Yeah.
But like we've kind of pulled away from it a little bit. But see, we were talking about the flashbacks. Jackson, you mentioned the flashbacks to the hunting trip that Mike and Paul go on.
Yeah.
I, to begin with, when they started showing these kind of like very brief and kind of fairly inconsequential seeming flashbacks to the hunting trip, I was like, what are we doing here? And I thought it was kind of cool that by the end, obviously, it became the main vehicle for charting his kind of descent or what you understand about him.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of this movie, to be honest, that I've had. Part of why I've rewatched it so many times is like I feel like there's sort of like there's a deeper meaning in a lot of it, and it's really intrigued me. And so there's bits where I've like gone back and like rewatched certain scenes, and just I've seen the movie quite a number of times at this point, but it's just there's so much to kind of like glean from it, and it's nice too that it's like you can watch it 10 times and you won't have all the answers. Yeah, I think your assessment though is pretty spot on about that kind of charting his character arc of the movie.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of cool the intervals that you're kind of fed those scenes, and then obviously the last one is just flat out insane. But but where it's placed in the kind of escalating chaos of the rest of it, I think it works quite nicely.
But the fact that he was a hunter kind of leads to him being pegged pretty quickly as the prime suspect in this, certainly this original murder, which he's approached by Detective Mendoza, played by Art Evans, who was in Fright Night as well. He was Detective Lennox in Fright Night. He seems to know pretty quickly, or certainly feel pretty quickly, based on Paul's past. They kind of look in and they're pretty sure pretty quickly that Paul's their man. Plus, there's some tire tracks that kind of correlate.
That's a good character moment, actually. See, when Mendoza's talking to Paul for the first time, and I think he's trying to get in to install something next door to where the murder is that right?
Yeah.
And then Mendoza's talking to him, and they have what starts off as being this very amiable conversation, and that becomes kind of really accusatory and really kind of harsh very abruptly.
Very quickly.
Undoubtedly. I mean, it's a weird thing, too, because, one of the things I've kind of found out through like talking to lawyers and other types is it's like they can actually know when someone is guilty. I mean, obviously not in all cases, but there's a lot of like there's a real like burden of proof you kind of have to put on someone in order to get them to nail them as guilty.
Yeah.
And it's like there's so much stuff that can just be inadmissible because there's like a simple explanation for why they might not have done that. Like, for instance, if you're like, oh, they sent me this photo and that's like clearly not the person's hand or something, and like this other hand is like, has this like scar on it or something. They'll be like, oh, well, maybe they put like, some kind of makeup over it, and that's why the scar isn't there. And it's like there's just stuff like that where suddenly they're like, oh, because they might have done that, now it doesn't count. It's interesting to me, like how kind of difficult it is to like prove someone is guilty with these things.
The whole beyond reasonable doubt thing goes quite far.
Yeah.
So it's right about this point that one of the more bizarre scenes in the film comes round. It's when Paul is tasked with going round to fix Ann Mason's satellite.
Yes.
Ann Mason is quite the character. She's not backwards and coming forwards, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And we turn up at Anne's house to find her wearing a negligee, a fur coat, a gigantic diamond necklace, and drinking a martini right in the middle of the afternoon. Living her best life.
Yeah, strong attire for a Tuesday, I feel.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting window into kind of like what this era was, because I remember being a little kid, and the way her character looks there is like how I imagine grown-ups looking, or it's like grown-up women, because it was just it was like during this time I mean, like I was a little too young, I think, when this movie came out, but his look sort of like extended to maybe like 93 or 94, you know, but it was just like women just looked like that. You know, it's like they'd be like these like career women, and they would just have like that. They'd always be like done up like that. And I'm sure a lot of that was from like movies or TV or whatever, but it just was, it just was like very stuffy, very like, you know, like big shoulder pads, like the whole crazy, you know, done up hair or huge hair or whatever it was. And it just, it formed a really interesting sort of image in my head. And now that, you know, I'm in my 30s and seeing that, I'm just like, God, like no women dress like that like, at all. I mean, like maybe if you're like a United States like senator or something, you might, but it's like I just don't see any women dress anything like that. She's just a totally fascinating character, and it's just this weird sort of like bored yuppie housewife thing is just getting drunk and, you know, kind of like fooling around with his character, and it's just so
not just his character. She fools around with more than just his character.
No, totally. But I mean, it's like it's I don't know. I mean, I've met a few you know, previous job I had. You know, I'm not going to say who, but the wife of this guy I worked for was not that dissimilar from this character. Okay. So it was just it's very interesting to me.
What I particularly love is that she's so overtly sexual, but they're having this kind of humdrum conversation about the satellite. She's just like, she's just rubbing herself up and down him, like kind of like a bear scratching himself on a tree. She's like rubbing herself all over him while they have this weird conversation about the state of her satellite.
Yeah, it's pretty funny.
Absolutely.
And then she does that weird thing where she climbs up on the coffee. Like, he kind of spurns her advances a little bit.
Not immediately, to be fair.
Not immediately. He does kind of engage a little bit. Let's be quite honest. Although he's trying not to, he's cheated several times in this scene.
I think that's fair.
Absolutely.
But he kind of goes to leave, and she does that. She climbs up on the coffee table and hikes up her negligee and shows him something in her nether regions.
That was the work of a Cuban boy.
That was the work of a young Cuban boy. I don't know if you care to speculate, but I'm thinking. I'm
at a loss on that one.
I'm thinking either a tattoo or some kind of pubic topiary.
Excellent use of the word topiary.
I'm not sure. I mean, your mind can certainly wander in a number of directions there, but.
Yeah, I think that functions better as an unanswered question.
I do have to say, no matter what the situation down there, you shouldn't really have a young Cuban boy doing it for you.
Regardless.
No, it doesn't seem appropriate.
Not.
But it's an interesting one though. Like that scene is interesting because, like you say, I mean, we've all kind of come to some consensus that Paul's cheated there.
Oh, most certainly.
And again, but like you say, I mean, at the end, like I tend to I can write characters off for that in films sometimes.
For their moral choices?
Yes.
Okay.
Like, I was like, I don't like that guy anymore. But like what you're saying, Jackson, like Paul stays at least halfway likable all the way at the end, regardless of kind of the descent that you see, but also the kind of like shaky moral decisions and ethical decisions that he makes along the way.
Oh yeah, and I mean it's a weird thing because it's like I don't think you're supposed to like agree with what he's doing.
No,
you know, it's like it's never presented as like, oh, he's like a total stud and like look how cool he is. You know, it's very much like he's making the wrong decision, but there's still some aspect of him that is likable, or at least like you can kind of like empathize with in a weird way. And I think in stark contrast, his friend, who, you know, was kind of like, he got, you know, jilted by the Cathy Moriarty character. Yeah, sure. And, you know, it's like, I actually think he comes across as much more unlikable in the movie. And it's like, you don't... I'm not
Mike.
sure.
Yeah. Yeah, Mike. Yeah.
Yeah, Mike.
Certainly,
and
certainly in the early running, he comes across as more unlikable. He becomes a bit more of a kind of figure of pity when we kind of see him again in the now, if you like, rather than in flashback.
Yeah, and it's yeah, I mean, it's definitely weird that he's still hung up on, this girl, however many years later from that, where you're like, okay, there's something wrong with him too. But toward the end of the movie, when he's like going and like seeking revenge and trying to help her, it's almost like she doesn't want it, Yeah. And there's something fascinating too with that, just with like the different relationship dynamics, where it's like you can have someone literally ready to murder you and you're still loyal to them.
Yeah.
It's like you're like, oh, you almost murdered our daughter and and me and all this, but it's like she still feels like something for him.
Sure,
It's a very kind of mature look at these like dysfunctional, abusive relationships, and very true to life.
But she's not particularly nice to him when she meets him again, and kind of behind his back she's really nasty about him because he offers her some homemade peanut butter, which is weird. And she kind of knocks it back, and he's absolutely obsessed with hot chocolates, you sexy thing. But then she's away kind of bitching about him behind his back, because in fact Mike says, whatever you do, don't tell Paul that you met me. And in the very next scene, she tells Paul absolutely everything about the whole exchange.
Yeah, I mean, it is. It's. I don't want to get off on too much of a tangent here, but I mean, there's a couple friends of mine, like a writer director friend of mine. They were in New York recently, and they were like meeting at a cafe. And outside there was this woman who was like arguing with her boyfriend, and the guy like went and like backhanded her like in the middle of the street.
Fuck.
And they were like, whoa, what the fuck? And so they like went out and were like, dude, get the fuck away from her. Like, what are you doing? And the guy started coming in on them, and the girl was like, no, just leave him alone. Like you don't understand. Like, you're making things worse. Just like leave us alone. Just let us like finish this. And they were like, lady, like you need to get the fuck away from this guy. And they ended up basically, I think like the couple somehow like ended up getting away from him. And but I was like, that is insane. This guy like literally assaulted this woman in like the middle of broad daylight on a busy street, and she's still loyal to the guy. It's like to the point where she's arguing with these total strangers who are like trying to who care about her well-being more than he does.
Yep.
And it's a very real thing, but it's fascinating.
Yeah, I just want to touch on the next murder scene just quickly.
Yeah.
I know we have kind of touched on how horrific the drowning scene in the bath is, and it is. But the lead up to it is
the best thing ever.
It makes me laugh so hard every single time. When the killer comes sweeping, or Paul, I might as well just say it's Paul at this point, we know, comes sweeping into the room and delivers what I don't think could unfairly be called a tombstone pile driver. Onto the bathroom floor.
When we watched this together, and we both shouted "Tombstone Pile Driver" when it happened.
Is that the Undertaker's move?
Yeah, it's Undertaker. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I haven't watched wrestling in a really long time, but I remember that being his like
his signature
thing where he like puts you between his nuts and slams your head into the ground. It's pretty brutal.
It's an interesting choice. It seems like it would be easier to, I don't know, like candlestick or just something that you've got to hand to deliver a pile driver. Seems quite.
I enjoyed the spectacle of that moment.
Oh no, it's definitely a spectacle.
Yeah,
but I mean, obviously off the back of that, it was a dark moment anyway. But knowing what we know and what you've told us, obviously way darker.
Yeah.
But the drowning in the bath thing is probably, it's the moment in the film that got under my skin the most by a margin.
Oh yeah. Well, it's also too. It's like it's such a nasty, like cruel way to murder someone.
Yeah.
Where you're fully like showing them, hey, you're dying, and like almost like turning it into a joke on some level.
Yeah.
And it's like an unbelievably cruel murder, and I mean it's I think it says a lot about his psychology that he did that to himself, basically, or coerced his wife into shooting him. But yeah, that was a real that scene very much like struck a chord with me, because I was like, okay, this is very different. This is not just the standard like, they shove their head underwater, or you see them like struggle, like the water splashing around, and like, they do all the frenetic kind of quick cuts over it. And instead it's just very deliberate, very slow, very like, he's very much enjoying watching her die, and it's, it's very kind of mean and twisted.
And the visual for us, the viewer, I mean, it's very stark, very brightly lit scene, very colourful. It's a really colourful bathroom. And
it's like at like 2 p.m. also.
Yeah.
It's not like a spooky nighttime thing. It's like, no, it's broad daylight. The light is coming in.
This is a guy who does his killings by daylight. He does his killings straight after lunch.
Yeah, I don't think any of none of the murders really take place at night in it, which is also
kind of interesting.
Yeah, it's very rare. I mean, I know there's like other horror movies and slasher films where, the murders take place during the daytime. I can't think of one. I mean, I know Sleepaway Camp 2 has a good number of them that take place during the day, but yeah, it's a super bold choice.
It's a great scene. It's followed by a scene, I think it's right after this, with it's something that just freaks me out because it's in such tight close up. Is the policeman flossing his teeth?
See,
oh yeah,
for a long time.
Yeah, but that's another thing too. It's very rare you see characters flossing their teeth in their movies. Like, you see them brushing their teeth all the time, but yeah, it's another one of those things. Like, it's just sort of a rarity to find that.
I think all these things are designed very deliberately to be unsettling.
See,
because there is a lot of real tight close-up stuff.
There's another one like this, and it's a little bit later on, but you know how one of the bodies has been like wrapped up using that wire?
Yeah, it's like that plastic ribbon stuff.
Yeah, exactly that. Yeah, at one point during the kind of police interviews that happen later, one of the investigators, is using that to dig dirt from underneath his fingernails.
Oh yeah,
and I felt the same watching that as I did with the floss sequence, where I was like, why is this making me so uncomfortable?
I'm telling you, the big thing with it is like there's so much of this movie that it just. I'm not sure how deliberate a lot of it is. I mean, it feels very deliberate to me, and very, precise and well thought out. But it's like it just comes from an unsound mind, and there's no way around it. And it's like, this is not a movie that ever could have been made in like a real, studio system. And I mean, it's like this thing never would have made it past like getting coverage, because like you read the script and you're like, what the? You're like, okay, so it's psychopath, and we're like kind of supposed to empathize him with it, and his wife is like still in love with him after he's done all this horrible stuff, and it's like there's so much on paper where people would just be like, absolutely no way we're making this movie, and to Cannon's credit, they did. I haven't read it's actually like based on a book, and I think it's taken some pretty huge liberties with it. I haven't read the book. I need to, but it's like he's a carpenter in it. It takes place in Connecticut, and there's like I imagine it's a very different read than it is a viewing experience.
Yeah, I'd be quite interested to know, I think, now.
Yeah,
I do want to know exactly how liberally this has been adapted from the source material. I think that would be interesting.
Yeah, it's not even called White of the Eye. It's called Mrs. White.
Yeah, that's
Mrs.
right.
White. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. One thing that I think the film does quite well is that I think that obviously what you have there was this kind of like one of the more elaborate kind of set piece murders in the film.
Yeah.
And it comes pretty much straight out of that into some pretty heavy character stuff. Because you've got the police interviews, and what you've got is Joan basically providing Paul with an alibi for one of the murders.
Yeah.
Because she's also having to say in front of him and in front of the investigators that she knows that he's done what he's done. Yeah. And he's had an affair, or he's been doing what he's been like, and he's been doing that, and he's been, and I think that's interesting. It's a really good scene. It's really well done. It's like it's. I love the fact it's so insular. It's in such a small room, but I think that coming out of something that's such an kind of horror set piece into something that is quite a subtle piece of character stuff is quite interesting.
Yeah, well, it's also too it is a really complicated thing. Like, I don't want to, get into any of my own, like, weird dating history, but,
please do.
No. I'm not going to. But, I mean, like, there is times where it's like, there's certain people you meet and you're like, okay, on paper, this person's perfect and they have, like, everything going for them. And then there's something where you get a little kind of restless or whatever with the relationship, where it's like, for whatever reason, your interior doesn't totally click with theirs, even though it's like they can be attractive, have a good career, be like a kind person, smart, have everything going for them. And then there's these other times where it's like you can, meet someone who, like is, you can introduce them to your friends and they can be completely insane. And your friends are like, oh my God, what do you see in that person? And you're like, no, they're great. Like that. And it's like you can have a tendency to kind of overlook a lot of the stuff about them that you don't like because these other elements work for you for whatever reason. Yep. And, it's like I think we've all sort of been in relationships with someone where, our friends kind of arched an eyebrow at them, where they're like, this person seems to have a severe drinking problem, or, is like a huge drug addict, or has, a wealth of emotional problems, or, is mentally unstable. Who knows? Like, it's not necessarily any of those things.
I think you're reading my online dating profile from when I was...
But yeah, I mean, it's also, it's like we're willing to go a lot further for those types.
Yeah.
I mean, like, this is, assuming you don't go to therapy or something to handle those things, which I'm a big proponent of everyone doing. So, like, not be in, like, self-destructive, horrible relationships. But, it's fascinating to me that, there's so many people that I've met, who fall in with these things. And, like, I've met, there's other women I've met and have been friends with that very much would date a guy like Paul, and, just they'd make excuses for everything they've done, and it's like, it's not all like, and by like, I'm also, very conscious. I'm not speaking that every woman does that, not by a long stretch, but there's like a handful of girls I've met, who have, been attracted to these types, and men the same way, where they're attracted to these just destructive, kind of abusive personalities. And like, they just blame themselves for everything that goes wrong in it, and will cover them to the ends of the earth.
Sure.
Even when it's clearly not in their best interest, and they're actually like putting themselves in danger. So yeah, that was a huge digression, but I wanted to touch on that.
It was a worthwhile one.
Yeah, do you think that's an element of what you're seeing happening here, like in this scene?
Yeah, absolutely. Because like, she's still angry at him, which is normal and human, but there's a deeper thing that when you're getting questioned by like a detective, and they're like, hey, we think your husband has killed these people. You're like, holy shit, like, I'm getting the fuck away from this person. Like, there's something very disturbing and wrong here, which I think would be like the sane person's response. But, she goes in the exact opposite way, even though she kind of knows he did it to cover for him.
Well, I mean, it's because it's this kind of like emotionally confrontational thing between the pair of them, between her and him, but also she knows that in kind of forcing this confrontation, she's also kind of exonerating him, at least in the short term. And I think
Yeah,
it's really
absolutely.
interesting. It's really interesting.
But no sooner does she do that than she happens upon his stash of liberated body parts, which he keeps under the bath.
Yeah, exactly.
Good scene. Good scene.
Yep, so she finds
Absolutely.
out almost immediately after getting him out of police custody that he is in fact the killer.
Yeah,
And
because he's got him in that like weird tank or whatever it.
It's like-
I don't know how to describe. Yeah, you guys know what I'm
the
talking
bath is kind of
about.
boxed in. It's kind of boxed in with like a wooden. It's kind of set in a wooden kind of frame.
Yeah.
And underneath the soap dish, for some reason, is where he's chosen to hide these items.
Yeah, she finds like a kind of loose kind of thread thing poking out, and she pulls it, and it leads her back to the kind of soap dish, which she gouges out of the frame.
Yeah.
And then she kind of lights a lighter and looks down there, and that's where she finds all the stuff.
And
all
then
the body parts.
And then Paul loses his mind spectacularly fast.
He sure does.
And on a massive scale.
Yeah, so I mean, we're at the point when he starts. Did we go into like him like stabbing the bed and?
Well, no,
and
that comes up pretty quickly after that because she kind of barricades herself in a closet, and he does like the Michael Myers thing and smashes the door down to get her out. And then they have a weird sex scene.
Yeah, totally. And it's like a completely not titillating sex scene.
It's like unbelievably desexualized sex scene.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just so
functional.
Yeah, exactly. Like you're literally just, and it's interesting too that they're able to pull that off without it being laughable. Because I feel like there's so many sex scenes. If you've ever watched any of them with a crowd, it like brings the house down because they just come across like very absurd and silly in a crowd. And this is just like, no, I'm extremely uncomfortable during this bit. And it's like they have that, which I also think is a great window into their relationship, and
then he stabs the bed to pieces.
Yeah, he does.
And tells her to clean it up.
Well, and sorry to cut you off.
No.
The thing he says there that's always stuck with me after he goes completely fucking insane in that, and he's just like, he stabs the bed, which feels like, like 50 times or something, and he turns to her and goes, "Clean up this mess," and he doesn't say, "Clean up my mess," like therefore not taking any responsibility for it, and just immediately puts it on her of like, I'm not responsible, and now you have to fix this. Yeah. And that's another just great window into these types of like abusers and just like
emotionally abusive stuff.
Yeah, and it's just it's just very real, and I mean it's also too at this time. I mean, like it just now feels like people are kind of starting to be conscious of that stuff on some level. And it's like to see them doing this, over 30 years ago at this point is hugely impressive.
Yeah, that's true. In fact, like, you're hitting on something there that hadn't really occurred to me when I was watching it. But you're right. It's like, there's some pretty perceptive relationship stuff in there as well.
Yeah.
Totally. I mean, it's like that scene is always like very much stuck out to me because it's also just, it's so unbelievably cruel. And it's like, not only that, it's like there's long-term effects of that. I mean, apart from the psychological ones of like, he literally just destroyed the bed they sleep on every night.
Yeah, the marital bed.
To make a point and to like humiliate her and like force her to do something she shouldn't. And that, he'll ultimately like blame on her. It's like you made me do this is like what is the underlying subtext to that scene.
Yeah,
that's how he kind of signs off from that, isn't it?
And then he gets madder and madder and makes himself an explosive vest.
Yes.
Things escalate very abruptly from here.
Yeah, and so it's like he builds a vest made of dynamite and paints himself up like like a samurai warrior.
Yeah, that's right.
And like does his hair in that like kind of like samurai like ponytail style thing. And it's just super fucking eerie seeing him take that turn. and because it just snaps, and it's like there's a lot of people I know, who've been in those relationships where they talk about suddenly it was just like the wrong thing was said or something, and the person just turned it was like there was like another face revealed where suddenly they were not the person that they knew and had been dating, and like this sort of monster just shows up and appears. And they have the whole bit with her getting locked in the the attic, and I don't know if I'm getting too far ahead.
No. Something that tickled me,
yeah.
Just quickly was Danielle has to kind of save the mum and get her out of the attic room, and she says, was it something like, Dad's wearing a bunch of hot dogs?
Yeah, which I actually have an amusing aside to take away from all the sort of grim real life stuff we're talking about.
Uh-huh.
But when they played it at the silent movie theater, my friend Phil told me there was some dude I think came up and was like, "Oh yeah, that scene where he's like wearing all the hot dogs is crazy." Like he didn't realize like that was dynamite. Like he took as like, oh, he's like wearing a bunch of hot dogs, which I was like, I don't know how he thought all these hot dogs explode later on, but
which would arguably be even more insane.
No, totally. But it's like it's interesting seeing that filter through like a child's mind of like, oh, he's wearing a bunch of hot dogs, and
it did also remind me of that scene from The Simpsons when Principal Skinner is like, I have a bomb and it's Armour hot dogs. What kind of man wears Armour hot dogs?
Yeah. That's genius. I did not make that connection. That's fucking hilarious.
Oh, I did that immediately. No, but it's like, but yeah, no, you're right. And it's... This is in the middle of what I would say is like an unbelievably sharp escalation of the kind of drama and just driving this thing towards its conclusion.
It's like they get to the bit where she jumps out the window.
Danielle is kind of...
Danielle jumps at... Her mom is like, just jump, like, get the fuck out of here.
Throws her into some bushes.
Yeah, and like drops her, and she's just like, run, and then... He like knocks her out of the way and then is like loading up the rifle and like aiming at her. He's like, run, Danny, and just starts like shooting at her. And it's such a fucking terrifying, insane thing that he's like telling this to this poor girl and prompting her to like run for her life while he's like trying to just fucking shoot her and kill her.
It's an interesting insight into how far off the deep end Paul is at this point as well, because like when Joan had tried to call her friend to take Danielle out of the situation, come and get Danielle, because she knew this was going to escalate. And then when she calls back to say that she can't do it, Paul takes the call.
Right, yeah.
And he turns around and gets furious, being like, I can't believe you thought I would hurt my own kid. And then literally you're 5 minutes later in the runtime and he's just like firing indiscriminately at her while she's running down the road. And it's like, at that point I was like, okay, this guy is off book.
Yep.
Oh, totally.
Cuckoo.
Yeah. But yeah, it's fascinating too, because there's an interesting thing about people being like, oh, I could never do that, and admitting that, and then you see them doing that same thing later on, through like whatever the circumstances. This is a bit of a tangent, but did you guys see Super Dark Times?
Yes, I saw it. Yeah, it's on Netflix over here.
Yeah, so I mean that movie does a really good job of showing the kind of like slippery slope you can get to like becoming a murderer. And it's like, see how that happens. You're like, oh my God, what a horrible accident. And then you're like, oh, that maybe the guy liked it. And then you're like, oh, okay, now this is very different, And so it's like you see the escalation of that stuff. But yeah, I just wanted to make a quick aside about that.
It's a pretty good parallel to draw. That's a fucking great film as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So we're kind of coming down to the end now.
Yeah.
Cathy Moriarty, she escapes, hops in the car and takes off towards the quarry.
Yes.
Which presumably is quite close by.
I think that, like, when it becomes like the car chase and the standoff in the quarry, I think it's still okay, but I think that in terms of tension, the stuff in the house works way better.
Yeah, I agree, and I do think, the ending turns into something very different. This is very much like an atypical climax, because in a bizarre sense, Cathy Moriarty is essentially like the one we're really empathizing with, in that we're in her shoes. She's still kind of rooting for her psycho husband, and like feels all this grief and pain, and like, when he gets in that fight, with Mike, and he gets shot, and he's like, she's like, oh, do you want me to shoot you? And he's like, oh, why would you do that? Like, and it's like, it's clear he's probably like paralyzed at that point.
Yeah, he gets shot. Like, he gets shot not just a little bit in the legs. He gets shot a lot in the legs with a very large machine gun. Yeah,
the thing is like a fucking like a military machine gun they'd use to like take out like a fucking Jeep or something, and you see this.
And it shoots his fucking legs.
Yeah, and it's like, and he like can't move clearly. And there's another interesting, deeper parallel there, where his wife, who he co-wrote this movie with, Donald Cammell, she's like asking like, oh, do you want me to shoot you? And
oh my
she
God,
ended up shooting him later on in real life, and it's like, that's one of those things, like, I've always kind of remembered that during that scene, and he's like, oh, why would you want to do that, and he's sort of making a joke of it in a weird way, and he's like still sort of superficially charming, and he gets to that bit where he's about to just blow up his vest with, like, he's like, oh, I want to smoke, and I'm sort of like forgetting what the exact sequence is, but he ends up like grabbing him and lighting his vest up.
He sneakily lights his vest mid-conversation. He has his hand behind his back and lights the fuse mid-conversation between Mike and Joan.
Yeah, and so he lights it up, and then the guy, like, Mike quickly realizes he's going to die, and then shoots him. I'm sure to the point of killing him before the bomb goes off.
Oh, absolutely.
He's like aiming at his head or whatever. It's like, I'm sure his head was a fucking stump, before they cut a, it's like they show the gun going off, but it's like very clear how insanely powerful that gun is.
Oh yeah, like he's blown his head clean off his shoulders at that point.
You hear a lot of gunfire as well. He fires a lot of rounds into him.
Yeah, and it's like that's the kind of thing where it's like those types of guns, if you ever go to like a shooting range, they put the hole of it'll be like a coffee can size hole in you. That's like fucking gigantic. It's crazy. But anyway, he lights that up. There's a massive, insane explosion.
An enormal bomb.
She jumps. What's that?
An enormal bomb.
Yeah, exactly. And it's but she jumps in the water, and like they cover it from so many different angles. Like there's like a helicopter angle and all these other things, and it's like a magnificent sight to behold. It's very impressive, and they have this huge operatic music swelling in the background during it. But it was it's like you see her jump in there, she escapes, and then we cut to that scene later on where she's talking to the detective, that dude from Fright Night, and she's like, oh, 10 years gone with the wind, and he's basically like trying to kind of minimize the sort of experience. I can't remember what his exact line is, but yeah,
is it not like, what's 10 years when you're in love or something like that?
Yeah, exactly. He says, what is 10 years when you're in love? And I was like, it's such a bizarre sort of like theme of the movie of like, oh, who cares if you're in this nightmare, horrible relationship, as long as you're in love during it. Yeah. And it's like, no matter how abusive the person is and how unstable and psychotic they are, if you love them, it's okay.
It's totally fine.
It's like it's like in complete opposition to basically like everything else kind of like leading up to, you know, that point in the movie. And then they end with you know, she like looks over her shoulder and they do that kind of like dissolve or that still of her.
Yeah, that's
and
weird.
then they start with that end theme, which is I love that end credits music. I think it's just haunting and beautiful. But yeah, I mean, they give a little like kind of caveat of like, okay, life goes on and she still has her kid, and you know, like she'll be fine by movie standards, I guess. But yeah, it was just it's such an odd scene to kind of cap off the movie.
It's a really, really strange end scene, and I honestly don't know if I think that it's a good or a bad or a strange decision or what it is. But I think that like as a final scene, I mean, like I say, I only saw this today. I'm still processing a lot of this, and yeah, like it's a really strange sign-off scene. I'm not sure how I feel about it. Like, it's a strange choice.
But nevertheless, that is the end of the film. That is how it ends. And there's no getting away from that, Mitch.
Yeah, and I mean, like, Jackson, this is a really interesting selection. And what I would say is, after about maybe 40 minutes of it, I said to Andy, I was like, without saying anything about where I came up pro or con in the film, is like, I'd really like to know just like why you picked this. And it's interesting to me that you came across it later, that you came across it in 2015.
Yeah.
Because most of the time when people come on here and they choose films, it's something that they've had a kind of long-standing connection. Maybe they saw it like when they were too young to really have seen it. You know, like somebody saw something that would be like an 18 cert film. They saw it when they were 10 for whatever reason. And they're telling a story of something that is this kind of like deep-seated childhood affection for a film, which I think kind of colours your judgment, and you can't really be objective about it. When you have this kind of nostalgia, you can't quantify the reasons why you love something, and it makes it hard to talk about it and hard to defend and hard to speak about in a way that's grounded. So it was interesting that you brought this to the table as something that you'd only seen in the last couple of years.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was, you know, it's interesting to me because a lot of I did one other podcast that was a little similar to this, and I think I'm spacing the name of it right now, which I hope the guy does not listen to this this episode, but like we were talking about Nightmare on Elm Street 4, which is a movie I've like had a soft spot for a very long time.
Okay.
A lot of it was because it was the first proper horror movie I ever watched, and it made a huge impact on me, but. You know, it was interesting with this because so many of I'm sure most of the movies are exactly what you guys have said, where it's like someone, you know, had an affinity for a lesser loved movie when they were younger because they caught on VHS or on cable or whatever. It hit them at the right age, and it's like forever kind of coated in amber as this like wonderful sort of cinematic experience they have, which I don't take anything away from any of those people. Like you know, your favorite movie could be, you know, Neil Breen's Fateful Findings or something, or you know, just something that's like widely, or you know, From Justin to Kelly, you know, like if you had a great experience with that when you were younger and like that's an important movie to you, then fine, like you should keep that. Like I don't think people should be convincing others that their tastes are, or it's like if they like that, that's fine. You know, it's like you might not agree or whatever, and like I think it's worth having a discussion over, certainly. But like I don't, you know, like try to like lord anything over someone for liking something I don't.
Yeah,
you know, or
I mean,
I try not to anyway.
Yeah, I like understanding why people love things, and I think that if I don't, I think the two things that I like to do is I'd like to understand why this thing that I don't get means so much to another person, but I also wouldn't dream of condescending to people for liking it for whatever reason they want.
Exactly. But no, I mean, so much of it was just, it resonated with me because of the era that it was made, the location, and just how deep I kind of thought a lot of the character stuff was in it, which is, you know, I don't think it's unusual for a genre movie, but it is unusual to see it presented in this way. You know, it's like I do think a lot of genre movies are very smart with like the thematic underpinnings of these movies and what they're trying to say. And, you know, there's some incredibly brilliant genre filmmakers who, you know, have not gotten their appropriate accolades because just still, even though horror is hot right now, there's so much of like the mainstream public that just it's like you tell them to watch a movie like Phantasm or whatever, and they're like, oh, whatever. It's like they can't, like look deeper at it, being like, oh, this is sort of like a metaphor for this kid's grief, over like losing his parents, and there's all this kind of smart stuff baked into the film. But yeah, it had such a huge effect on me because of the way it's photographed, like the actors. I think they're all like, David Keith and Cathy Moriarty are phenomenally cast in this. Yeah. Like I truly, I could maybe see like Jeff Fahey playing, his role, but apart from that, or like Brad Dourif or something. But he just is so perfect in this role because he really doesn't seem like he's like an evil guy, No. And it's like, it's like you look at him in Firestarter, and he's like the good dad in that, and he's like super loving with his daughter, and and like you're so on his side, and he's just so sincere and real, and like you really care about him. And seeing him in this, where he just becomes this total psychopath, and there's still a weird level of sympathy or whatever for the guy. It's very impressive because it's rare that a horror movie can try to humanize the bad guy in a way that's effective, because so much of the time they humanize, like, it's like, oh, well, humanize Leatherface. And then you're like, cool, he's not scary now, and I don't give a shit. It's like, now I completely don't care, and like, it's just sort of sad, and you're like, oh, so he was picked on and has like this horrible facial disfiguration. Okay, I'm really not afraid of him now. It's way scarier when he's this weird inbred redneck who's dressing up in, like women's skin and, like putting on an apron and like cooking for his family and just making all these bizarro sounds where you're like, okay, this is fucking terrifying. Like you're like, if I saw this coming at me, I would run very far away, versus the like, oh, this is really depressing and like gave me too much of an insight into why they turned into a psychopath.
Yeah, definitely.
Sometimes no background is better and scarier. Just
Absolutely.
Something just exists.
Yeah.
And it exists in that state, and we don't need to know anything other than this is fucking horrifying.
Yeah, definitely.
So Mitch, come on. Are you going to come down with an opinion on this one?
I am going to need a little bit more time to think about this one. There are a lot of things that I like about it, but I found, as a first watch today, I found it to be a really disorientating and kind of jarring experience. What I would say is, I will 100% watch it again.
Oh, great. Okay, good.
And like I say, the golden rule of these things, it's becoming is that I never come away from conversations like in a film less. I always come away more curious and wanting to know a little bit more about it. I will 100% rewatch White of the Eye. And I think that everything that you've said about it positively, I agree with. Mm-hmm. But I found it to be, like I say, quite jarring, quite overwhelming. And I'm going to go and I'm going to have another go at it, I think. Because I came out of it not having disliked it, but I came out of it just kind of mostly just wanting to talk to someone who had chosen it for this.
Yeah.
I wanted to know more about it from the perspective of someone who obviously loved it. Before we go back to you, Jackson, Andy, you'd seen it before?
Yeah, I'd seen it before. Uh-huh.
So what was your take this time?
My take this time, I think the benefit of a little bit more age.
And having seen more stuff.
And having seen more stuff. I still find it to be quite impenetrable at points and a little bit inscrutable, but it almost defies that anyway. I think it's a really interesting film, and there's a lot of really interesting stuff going on under what seems to be quite a confusing surface. Watching it again now, I feel I need to watch it again right away.
Yeah, I think I'll watch it relatively immediately.
Yeah. I didn't know any of the Donald Cammell stuff, and that's made me see the film in an entirely different light, and it's made me pretty much transfixed by this film.
Yeah, Jackson, that was an interesting insight and something that neither of us knew. So what obviously what you told us and what we now know about Donald Cammell and how some of the kind of weirdly specific darker moments in this informed real life things that happened to him and things that he did later. I feel like that alone kind of gives enough reason to watch this again.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that was a big draw for me, too, because when I did watch it the first time, I was like, what is it? I was just so, like, blown away by it, because it was like, I've never seen a movie like this. And then I got very interested in the backstory of it and read all that stuff. I was like, okay, I'm watching this again right now, kind of like how you guys just talked about. And then seeing it through that way, I was like, whoa, this is a fucked up movie.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
On so many levels, yeah.
Yeah, and I just kept kind of going back to it, and I'm always just very interested in those movies that are reveal like a deeper side of the filmmaker. Like, Vertigo is probably my favorite movie of all time, but like knowing all of Hitchcock's history with like basically trying to like remake these women into these things that are just this like kind of unattainable sort of like fantasy person, and just doing that over and over again, and like like literally having the person he wanted and went after and forcing her to change her appearance and conform her into this thing she never was.
Yeah.
It was always so resonant and like scary and disturbing to me. He was like very vocal about that, in interviews and stuff, I think, and plenty has been written about that.
Yeah.
Whenever you can get these kind of deeper windows into like a filmmaker's personal life, I just feel like it enhances the experience so much more.
Definitely.
Also, I feel like the film doesn't give a fuck if you get it or like it.
No.
Yeah, it just exists as it is.
Yeah,
and you can either choose to get on with it and try to figure it out, try to unravel it, or you can get off and fuck off. It doesn't seem like he cares. There's no.
It's very unapologetic in its kind of eccentricities and its more impenetrable elements. And I think that I always think that films come off stronger for doing that. Mm-hmm. For being kind of
in a way.
Yeah.
It's feels like kind of a fearless film because it is made with that complete lack of consideration for whether or not you get it.
Yeah, I agree completely.
Jackson, before we wrap up, I do want to take a minute to talk about a couple of things, most notably Beyond the Gates.
Oh, right on.
I just wanted to take a sec to just cover it, just for the benefit of anyone that's listening that might not have seen it or anything like that. So obviously, we met a couple of years ago when you took it to Fright Fest to Shepherd's Bush.
Yeah. No, I remember at that weird bar right next to the that place in Shepherd's Bush. At the Fright Fest after party. I remember it well.
Yeah. I'm not blowing smoke here. My affection for Beyond the Gates is well documented.
No, thanks, dude.
I think it's great, and I think people should check it out. And as we spoke about earlier, as we touched on, it's billed as a Shudder exclusive.
It is available on Shudder and
it's
on
available
DVD.
on Shudder, but it's also available on DVD because I do own a copy of it.
As do I. Yeah.
Is there anything that you want to say about the film to anybody that might not have seen it before? Maybe just kind of.
I'll just give the basic pitch that I was doing before the movie came out, but it's basically like the movie centers around a pair of estranged brothers whose father has gone missing. They grew up working in his video store, and after he's been missing for several months, they go to liquidate it. And while they're there, they end up finding a VCR board game that has something to do with his disappearance. So, it took a lot of influence from stuff like Phantasm and The Gate and, a lot of films of that era without, directly like lifting set pieces. And basically, the big thing with it was trying to tell a story like The Gate with grown-ups where they have these scars and just flaws and, have been through like abuse and alcoholism and all these, like making bad decisions or getting caught up in bad relationships or bad friendships, and seeing how characters like that would react to being able to cross over into another dimension in a spooky haunted house story, Yeah. So check it out if you haven't. I'm still just absolutely like thrilled with the reception of it, and that people have kept watching it. And I've had people who've like written to me where they're like, "Oh, I've watched it 18 times," which is insane to me. It's like it's a huge compliment, but it's a thrill. So I always get I'm always like very flattered and very touched to hear that it had a nice effect on someone. So yeah, thank you for the kind words.
That's cool. I like the fact that it kind of for the first little while it almost has this kind of mumblecore feel. And it kind of
yeah,
and
it goes into very weird. It's like it was very deliberately like split in half, where it kind of builds to there's some spooky stuff, but it's very much not structured like the familiar, here's the big opening scare, here's like the set piece every 7 minutes, and it takes a pretty hard right turn at the midpoint, after being sort of a family drama and turning into something pretty different.
Yeah, I like the kind of how did we get here feeling that you get when it gets to the third act.
Yeah, for sure. Well, yeah, thank you.
And yeah, just before we wrap up, first off, is there anything else project-wise you want to talk about, and also how can people catch up with you, social media-wise, and so on?
I'm off Twitter right now because it's just been it's become like very toxic. But we have a Beyond the Gates Twitter that Steve, my co-writer, runs, which I suggest following that for like any future career stuff that we're doing. But yeah, I'm working on a movie called The Day After Halloween right now, which is sort of like a post Final Girl movie. It goes into some pretty weird directions that we haven't really seen before, and like one of these horror movies, it almost pushes into kind of like a metaphysical sort of like Jekyll and Hyde direction.
Okay.
But we're casting that right now and just sort of putting that together. That's next on the docket, and then I have some other stuff that I'm just pitching and working on that are in various stages of development. But yeah, Day After Halloween looks to be the next one. So hopefully we should be filming that in October, and then get it out into the world and go from there.
Super.
Cool. Jackson, thanks a lot for taking the time.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Thank you, man.
Blast.
So one of the more interesting ones, I think, in terms of like, I still don't know what I make of this film.
Right.
What do you make of this film?
Like I said, I kind of like it. I find it unsettling, and I find it even more unsettling now that I know the thing about Donald Cammell and China Kong.
I think
if anything else, I'm completely intrigued by this film now.
I feel like I need to see it again.
I think I need to know more about it in general. I need to know the film.
And I think as well, I mean, like, this is why letting the guests choose the film, I think, is important, because people are coming in picking something they inherently they love, that they have looked into, and this is why we can kind of stand to learn these things from these stories, because the people that are coming on know their stuff and they're able to offer up this kind of thing, and I think that's interesting, and I thought Jackson did that really well tonight.
Absolutely. I took a lot away from tonight's conversation.
Also, just really cool that he only found the film like 2-3 years ago, and it was the first thing that he went to. I think that's fun. I like that a lot.
But you can understand what he said about people not liking the film.
Oh, absolutely. I completely understand that, because, like I say, there's a lot of things about it that I find quite jarring and quite uncomfortable.
Yeah, but it doesn't spoon feed you any answers, or it doesn't make life easy for you in the slightest.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
And that's a good thing.
I think, yeah, for the most part, I agree. Yeah, I think that's true, and I think it definitely does apply here. But I guess that's it for another one.
Yeah.
So big thanks as always to everyone for taking the time to check us out, and thanks especially to Jackson Stewart joining us for this. And
good strong surname.
Yep, strong, yeah. And Beyond the Gates, currently available on Shudder and on DVD in the UK. Get on that. It's a great film. It's worth your time. We will be back this Monday, 8 a.m. BST, as we announce our guest in film for the following week, and also just all of the various features that we've loaded into the minisodes now.
Yep, we've got all sorts in there now. We've got the What Were You Watching? We've got the feedback section. You're doing your Shockwaves 100, and of course, yes, Mitch's Pitches.
Yeah. I love the fact they're becoming a show in their own right.
A show in their own right.
I'm enjoying that very much. If you want to get in touch, if you disagree and think the minisodes would be better off being 6 minutes long, or if you want to
as they used to be.
Yeah, you can
return to their former glory.
You can get in touch in a whole load of ways. Facebook and Instagram, Strong Language Violent Scenes there. You can tweet us at StrongViolentPC, and you can also, of course, email us at stronglanguageviolentscenes@gmail.com.
Yep, and of course, wherever you're listening now, there might be other avenues that suit you better, so you can listen to us on Stitcher, iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Podbean.
So that's it for another one. Join us Monday if you can, and in the meantime, don't forget that it is better to die a hero than live as food in a world of chuds. Good night.
Goodbye.
You've been listening to Strong Language and Violent Scenes with Andy Stewart and Mitch Bain. Strong Language and Violent Scenes theme by Mitch Bain, production and artwork by Andy Stewart. Find us on Stitcher, iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and Podbean.